On the morning of January 10, 2000, two men stood at a podium in New York City and announced the largest corporate merger in the history of American business. One was Steve Case, the co-founder of America Online, a 41-year-old who had built his company from nothing into the dominant force in consumer internet. The other was Gerald Levin, the chairman and CEO of Time Warner, one of the most storied media conglomerates on earth, home to HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, Time magazine, and a catalog of content that defined 20th century American culture. Together, they announced that AOL was buying Time Warner for $182 billion. The deal, they said, would create the first fully integrated media and communications company of the 21st century. It would marry the world's largest internet service provider to the world's largest media company. It would combine online distribution with premium content. The internet and traditional media fused into a single unstoppable entity. The announcement made the front page of every major newspaper in the world. Stock markets across both companies surged. Industry analysts queued up on television to declare it visionary. Steve Case called it the launch of the next internet revolution. Within 2 years, the combined company reported a $99 billion annual loss, the largest in US corporate history. Within 3 years, the name AOL had been dropped from the corporate title entirely. Time Warner spent the rest of the decade trying to pretend the merger had never happened. Ted Turner, who had sold his Turner Broadcasting System to Time Warner in 1995 and owned approximately 9% of its shares, later estimated he had personally lost around $8 billion, roughly 80% of his entire net worth. The AOL-Time Warner merger is not merely a story about a bad deal. It is a story about what happens when bubble-era valuations are mistaken for real value, when two fundamentally incompatible corporate cultures are forced to share a building, and when the technological foundation of a business model begins to collapse at the precise moment that business is completing the largest transaction of its life. To understand what went wrong, you first have to understand what AOL actually was and how genuinely dominant it had become. America Online was founded in 1985 under the name Quantum Computer Services, rebranding as AOL when it went public in 1992. Under Steve Case, it pursued an aggressive strategy of mass market simplification. The early internet was confusing and intimidating for ordinary consumers. AOL made it approachable. It bundled email, chat rooms, news, entertainment, and a curated online experience into a single piece of software that came on a floppy disk and later a CD that AOL mailed to every address in America with the relentlessness of a religious movement. At its peak, AOL was reportedly spending a third of its entire production budget on those disks. You could find them in cereal boxes, on airline seats, at the checkout counter of every petrol station and supermarket in the country. It worked. By the late 1990s, AOL was accounting for roughly 60% of all US internet traffic. At its peak in 2002, it had over 30 million subscribers, each paying a monthly dial-up access fee. The company went public in 1992 at a price that, adjusted for splits, implied a tiny valuation. By early 2000, its stock had appreciated by approximately 50,000%. It was worth, on paper, around $226 billion. That number deserves scrutiny. AOL's revenues in 1999 were approximately $4.8 billion. Time Warner, the company it was about to buy, had revenues of $26.8 billion and 70,000 employees. AOL had 12,000 employees. Yet, because of the extraordinary multiple the market was placing on internet stocks, AOL's market capitalization was larger than Time Warner's. In the deal structure, AOL shareholders would own 55% of the combined company. Time Warner shareholders would own 45%. A company with one-fifth the revenues and one-sixth the workforce was, on paper, buying a company 6 times its size. It was doing so entirely in stock that was, by any conventional measure of earnings or cash flow, trading at an almost incomprehensible premium to its actual underlying business. This is the original sin of the deal. AOL used its inflated stock as acquisition currency to buy real tangible assets: a film studio, cable television networks, magazines, a music company, before the market could reassess what that stock was actually worth. Time Warner shareholders accepted AOL shares at face value. The face value was a fiction. Gerald Levin's motivations for accepting the deal have been analyzed extensively in the years since, and most of the analysis is not flattering. Time Warner was not a company in distress. It was a highly profitable media conglomerate with genuine, durable assets. But Levin had watched the internet boom reshape the media landscape and concluded that without a digital distribution strategy, Time Warner would be left behind. He believed, with genuine conviction, that the internet would soon deliver all media content directly to consumers and that a company without scale in that channel would be competitively disadvantaged. He also, according to various accounts, wanted a legacy. He had spent a career building Time Warner. The merger with AOL would be the capstone, the deal that put him in the history books as the man who invented the media company of the future. His board questioned the deal. His head of mergers and acquisitions questioned the deal. Ted Turner, who voted for it under pressure, later described his approval as the worst business decision he had ever made. But Levin drove it through, and when the FTC cleared the merger in December 2000, it closed in January 2001. By that point, the world had already changed. The Nasdaq stock market peaked on March 10, 2000, exactly 2 months after the merger was announced, at a level it would not reach again for 15 years. The dot-com bubble burst. Within months, hundreds of the companies that had been burning money on AOL advertising contracts went bankrupt. This matters enormously because a significant and growing portion of AOL's revenues, the revenues that underpinned the spectacular stock price that underpinned the deal's valuation, came from advertising sold to dot-com companies that no longer existed. The advertising revenue didn't slow down gradually, it collapsed. The growth projections that had justified AOL's extraordinary valuation and therefore the deal itself evaporated almost overnight. And because the merger had been structured as a stock-for-stock transaction, with the purchase price recorded on Time Warner's balance sheet at the valuation implied by AOL's share price at the time of closing, the combined company was now carrying an enormous amount of goodwill, accounting shorthand for the premium paid over the tangible asset value that reflected a company worth far less than the price at which it had been acquired. In 2002, AOL-Time Warner took a goodwill write-down of approximately $99 billion, the largest annual corporate loss in US history at the time. This was not a cash loss in the conventional sense. No money left the building that year because of the write-down. But it was the accounting system's formal acknowledgement that the deal had been done at a price that bore no relationship to the combined company's actual worth. As one financial historian put it, the bad news happened on the day the merger was announced. The write-down was just the finance department admitting it. The write-down was the headline number, but the day-to-day reality of the merged company was, in many ways, more damaging and more instructive. The two organizations were culturally irreconcilable from almost the first week. AOL, in its DNA, was a scrappy, aggressive, deal-making machine. It had been built by people who were accustomed to operating at internet speed, who had no reverence for tradition or legacy, and whose instinct was to move fast, push hard, and worry about the consequences later. The culture at AOL's Dulles, Virginia headquarters was competitive to the point of ruthlessness. Bonuses were tied to aggressive growth targets. The company had a history of pushing the boundaries of what was permissible. In 2002, it was revealed that AOL had been inflating its advertising revenue figures, and the company ultimately paid significant SEC fines as part of a settlement. Time Warner was something else entirely. It was a company made up of semi-autonomous kingdoms: Warner Brothers, HBO, CNN, Time Inc., each with its own culture, its own leadership, and its own long history of operating independently. Time Warner executives were, by temperament and culture, old media people. They made movies and television. They edited magazines. They ran cable systems. They moved slowly and carefully. They had built institutions that had lasted decades, and they were rightly proud of them. Into this landscape, the merged company dropped a new incentive structure that tied bonuses not to the performance of individual divisions, but to the performance of AOL Time Warner as a whole. The Time Warner division heads, who had no control over AOL's performance and no confidence in its leadership, resented this intensely. They watched AOL's numbers deteriorate quarter after quarter and saw their own compensation dragged down by a business they hadn't chosen to join. The AOL executives sent to integrate the businesses found resistance at every turn. Time Warner's divisions, which had historically operated as independent entities even within the pre-merger Time Warner structure, refused to cooperate with the synergy initiatives the new leadership was demanding. Attempts to bundle HBO content with AOL subscriptions went nowhere. Attempts to use Time Warner's cable infrastructure to accelerate AOL's transition to broadband stalled in arguments about pricing and priorities. The synergies that the deal had been premised upon, the idea that AOL's distribution and Time Warner's content would generate enormous mutual value, were largely theoretical. In practice, they required cooperation between organizations that didn't trust each other, couldn't agree on strategy, and had fundamentally different views of what the combined company was supposed to be. Bob Pittman, AOL's president and co-chief operating officer under the new structure, was perhaps the most aggressive advocate for the synergy vision. He pushed the Time Warner divisions hard. The resistance he encountered was fierce. By July 2002, he was gone. By the end of 2002, Gerald Levin had also resigned. By May 2003, Steve Case stepped down as chairman. 3 of the 4 most senior executives of the deal's architects had left the company within 2 years of closing. And the wreckage was not only financial, it was also technological. The merger's logic rested on a specific assumption that AOL's dial-up subscriber base was a durable asset that would transition to broadband, and that when it did, those subscribers would keep paying for AOL services through the faster connection. The first part of that assumption, that broadband would come, was correct. The second part, that subscribers would bring their loyalty with them, proved completely wrong. At the time the merger closed in January 2001, approximately 50% of American homes had internet access, but only about 3% had broadband. That ratio changed with remarkable speed over the next few years. By 2003, around 20% of American homes had broadband. By 2006, that had risen to 50%. The migration from dial-up to broadband was swift, and it was brutal for AOL. The reason is structural. AOL's dial-up product charged a monthly subscription fee for internet access. When you switched to broadband through your cable company or your telephone company, you already had internet access built into the monthly cable or DSL bill. You didn't need AOL anymore. The service that had once been the gateway to the internet, the thing that made the internet accessible to ordinary people, was no longer necessary. The gateway had been replaced by an infrastructure that made any gateway redundant. AOL's peak subscriber count of around 30 million came in 2002. Then it began declining year after year inexorably as broadband penetration rose. Each departing subscriber took their monthly subscription fee with them. The revenue base that had justified the $182 billion deal eroded steadily and permanently. What made this particularly ironic was that the solution was sitting right there inside the combined company. Time Warner Cable was rolling out broadband to millions of American homes. AOL could, theoretically, have used that infrastructure to transition its subscribers to a new broadband service under the AOL brand. Instead, the two organizations were so poorly integrated, so suspicious of each other, so entangled in internal politics that the opportunity was not captured. Time Warner Cable and AOL essentially operated as separate businesses that happened to share a corporate parent. The most obvious potential synergy of the entire deal was never realized. By 2003, the company had dropped AOL from its name. By 2009, it spun AOL off as an independent company. AOL went on to an undignified series of further transactions. Acquired by Verizon in 2015 for $4.4 billion, bundled with Yahoo into a division called Oath that Verizon subsequently wrote down by nearly $5 billion and eventually sold to Apollo Global Management in 2021 for $5 billion. That final price, for a company that had once commanded a valuation of $226 billion, represented a destruction of value so complete it almost defies straightforward expression. Time Warner, relieved of AOL, recovered its footing. HBO became the most acclaimed television network in the country. Warner Brothers built a superhero franchise. CNN endured. In 2018, AT&T acquired Time Warner for $108.7 billion. In 2022, AT&T spun the media assets off as Warner Brothers Discovery. The company has had its own financial difficulties since, but that is a different story. The core of what Time Warner was before AOL arrived, the content, the brands, the studios, retained its value. It was the AOL deal that nearly destroyed it. There is a certain temptation, 25 years on, to describe the AOL-Time Warner merger as an obvious mistake that only seemed like a good idea because everyone was caught up in dot-com mania. That is partly true, but also too easy. The underlying strategic logic was not wrong. The idea that internet distribution and premium content would one day be combined into a single vertically integrated business was, in retrospect, completely correct. Netflix built its own content precisely because it understood this logic. Disney acquired Fox and launched Disney Plus for the same reason. The convergence of distribution and content that Levin and Case were reaching for in 2000 is exactly what the most successful media companies of the 2020s are built around. They simply got the timing, the technology, the valuation, and the execution wrong on every dimension simultaneously. The technology was wrong because dial-up was already dying. The valuation was wrong because AOL's stock price had no relationship to its actual earnings. The timing was wrong because the deal closed as the bubble burst. And the execution was wrong because two organizations with no cultural common ground were asked to generate synergies that required trust, cooperation, and shared purpose they never developed. What the AOL Time Warner merger teaches, above all else, is the danger of mistaking momentum for permanence. AOL stock had risen 50,000% in 8 years. That rise was real. The wealth it generated was real. The subscribers who logged on every day through their dial-up modems were real. But the valuation implied by that stock price was not real in the sense that mattered. It did not reflect durable earnings power. It reflected market euphoria. When Steve Case used that stock to buy Time Warner, he was exchanging paper for bricks. The paper was worth a great deal in January 2000. By January 2002, it was worth almost nothing. And $226 billion of shareholder value, including the savings of thousands of employees whose retirement accounts were tied up in AOL Time Warner stock, went with it.